An independent clause contains a subject and a verb, and it's a complete thought. So an independent clause can stand by itself, so it can be a sentence. Like the sentence, I am running. See here we have a subject, I, and then we have this verb phrase, am, and running. And so it's a complete thought. It can stand alone and be a sentence. Now sometimes independent clauses have other clauses grouped with them, but they can also stand alone. Now a dependent clause also contains a subject and verb. However, it is an incomplete thought. And so we can take this independent clause up here and just add the word because to it, and it becomes a dependent clause. Because I am running still has a subject and a verb, but now we have the word because, and so it's a dependent clause. It's not a complete thought. You can't just say because I am running. You need something to go with it, like because I am running, I can't come to the meeting. And so that would be a complete sentence. So that's what a dependent clause is. Now, a noun clause can be a subject, a direct object, which I will abbreviate DO, an indirect object, abbreviated IO, or an object of a preposition. So, a noun clause can begin with WH question words, like what, which, when, where, who, or whom, and question words like how or if. Now, an adjective clause modifies a noun or pronoun. So, an adjective clause begins with a word like who, whom, which, that, whose, when, where, why. And it's going to follow the word it modifies. Then finally, we have an adverb clause, which modifies a verb, an adjective, another adverb, or an object of a preposition. Now, an adverb clause begins with a subordinating conjunction, such as after, because, since, unless, etc. And an adverb clause answers the question when, where, why, how, or to what degree, or under what condition. So that's a look at some different types of clauses.
Commas have many different functions, but their three primary functions are to separate clauses, join independent clauses, and they're used to avoid confusion. So since we talked about separating and joining clauses, let's first talk about what a clause is. A clause is a piece of a sentence. If you have a dependent clause, it is dependent on the rest of the sentence. It cannot stand alone as a complete sentence. It would be a fragment. If you have an independent clause, it would be able to stand alone as a sentence. It would be independently a sentence on its own. So dependent clause can't be a sentence by itself, depends on the rest of the sentence. Independent clause stands alone, can be a sentence all by itself. So let's look at how we can separate clauses with commas. You will use a comma to separate a dependent introductory clause from an independent clause. So one way that dependent clauses are used is as an introduction to a sentence. For instance, before the game, Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast. We use this comma to separate the dependent clause. So before the game is dependent. You cannot say before the game all by itself and have it be a complete sentence. It's only a prepositional phrase. So it is a dependent clause. But then you have Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast. This would be independent. It could stand all by itself. So we are separating the dependent introductory clause from the independent clause. Before the game, Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast. And you notice how you pause where that comma is. And a lot of times, that's why a comma is there, to get you to pause so that your sentence makes sense as you're reading it, either to yourself in a book or aloud to someone else. So, dependent clause as an introduction needs a comma. Now, let's look at if we kind of switch the order of the sentence up. Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast before the game. When we put before the game at the end of the sentence, we don't need to have that comma anymore. We only needed the comma whenever we wanted to pause to let people know that before the game was separate and to realize the action was happening after that. So Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast before the game. Here, we didn't actually have to put a comma because the independent clause came first. So we had our dependent clause at the end, no comma needed. Now this is in this situation. That doesn't mean there will never be a situation where you will have a dependent clause at the end that needs a comma. If you have several items in a series, you may still need a comma toward the end of the sentence. But if you're using an introductory phrase, if it comes at the beginning of the sentence, you need the comma. If it comes at the end of a sentence, generally you won't. Let's look at another way that we use commas to separate clauses. You will use a comma to separate two independent clauses joined by any of the following conjunctions. And a conjunction is basically a connector word. And, but, or, for, nor, so, and yet are common conjunctions. If you have two independent clauses, that means two phrases in a sentence that could stand as a sentence on their own, and they're connected by one of these conjunctions, then you will need a comma to separate those two. We are going to the movies, or we are going to a nice restaurant. So here's our conjunction, or. We are going to the movies is an independent clause. We are going to a nice restaurant is an independent clause. So the comma is needed to separate two independent clauses. Now, let's look at if we combine this sentence a different way. We are going to the movies or to a nice restaurant. Here, we have that or, which would be a conjunction, but let's look. We are going to the movies is an independent clause. To a nice restaurant is dependent. To a nice restaurant cannot stand by itself. We don't have a subject in that clause. In this version of the sentence, we had we are going still included. So we still had a subject and a verb, so this was a complete thought all by itself. So it was an independent clause. It could stand as a sentence. To a nice restaurant is missing that. It's missing both your subject and your verb. It's not been made a complete sentence, so it's dependent on the rest of the sentence to make sense. So in this instance, we did not have two independent clauses. So, no comma was needed. Okay, now let's look at the second primary function of a comma. to join independent clauses, to avoid short, choppy sentences. So generally, whenever we are going to join independent clauses, we're doing it so that we don't have a series of short, choppy sentences. Now you're going to see that this might look a little similar to where we separated independent clauses. Sarah plays softball and Sarah enjoys swimming. Okay, and this one we had an independent clause, or a conjunction, and an independent clause. Let's look at the next version of this set of clauses. Sarah plays softball, runs track, and enjoys swimming. So Sarah plays softball. This is independent. Runs track is dependent. We have our conjunction, and enjoys swimming is dependent. Yet we still had those commas. And then let's look at the last version. Sarah plays softball, Sarah runs track, Sarah enjoys swimming. So all three of these are going to be independent clauses because they are complete sentences. But they're short, choppy sentences. Sarah plays softball, Sarah runs track, Sarah enjoys swimming. We keep hearing Sarah over and over, and these sentences are short. We can combine them to make it a smoother flowing sentence. So you could have two independent clauses joined by a conjunction like we did up here, and then you would use that comma to separate them. But you are still joining multiple sentences when you do that. So you're using those commas to separate the clauses, but you are using them to also join two sentences into one. So Sarah plays softball and Sarah enjoys swimming. So here we used our comma to join these two independent thoughts. Sarah plays softball, runs track, and enjoys swimming. Well, we had dependent clauses here, but we still had a conjunction. The reason we're going to put commas here is because you've got 3 or more items in a series. If you list 3 or more items or clauses, activities in a series, you're going to separate them with commas. So the reason we're using it here is to separate 3 or more items in a series. Here we were using it to separate 2 independent clauses. And then at the end we had no commas. We just had 3 complete sentences, which basically equaled 3 independent clauses. So we had to find ways to combine them. So we could combine all 3 into one sentence, and we could use our rule of using 3 or more commas in a series to join these different independent clauses, or we could use our rule of separating 2 independent clauses with a comma and a conjunction and keep 2 independent clauses instead of separating it up and making it dependent clauses but 3 different activities in a series. We could say Sarah collects bananas, apples, and tomatoes. We would have to put commas in that series too. Sarah collects bananas, comma, tomatoes, comma, and apples. So when you have 3 or more items in a series, you have to put your commas to separate them. This is going to be helpful when you're combining different ideas to be able to join independent clauses and in other instances. If you have just 2 sentences that you would like to combine, you can do so using a conjunction and a comma. As long as it's still an independent clause on each side, you will need that comma. Let's look at the third primary function of a comma. They are used to avoid confusion. I want to eat chicken, broccoli, and corn for dinner. Without a comma in this sentence, it sounds like you're saying you want to eat chicken broccoli. Well, you probably don't know what chicken broccoli is, and that's because it's not a real food. What would make more sense is if we said I want to eat chicken, comma, broccoli, comma, and corn for dinner. Then you would be telling someone you would like to eat chicken, broccoli, and corn. 3 items, not chicken broccoli, which makes chicken look like an adjective to broccoli. Now, this comma here in a series, if you have 3 or more items, the comma immediately before and is optional. Some people like the way it looks, some don't. I like the way the comma looks. It helps me feel more organized when I'm writing, so I always put it in. But you definitely need this comma because otherwise the meaning of your sentence is unclear and you would not be avoiding that confusion that commas are supposed to help you avoid. Let's look at the next example. Before we eat, our dog has to eat. This doesn't make sense. Before we eat our dog, you're not going to eat your dog. But if you're reading this sentence quickly, without a comma there to slow you down and make you pause, you don't read it correctly. You would have to read it a second or third time to get what the author's meaning actually was. So you would say, before we eat, our dog has to eat. And maybe this is so that your dog isn't going to bother you while you eat. If your dog's already eaten, then you can eat happily. So before we eat, our dog has to eat. And this is one of those dependent introductory clauses like we talked about up here. We use a comma to separate clauses, and that can also avoid confusion. So you see how some of these rules tie in together. Commas in a series, commas in a series. Introductory clause being separated from the independent clause that is the rest of the sentence. Dependent clause separated from independent clause. So a lot of the rules of commas may overlap a little bit, but these are 3 of the primary functions you're going to see commas used for. That doesn't mean you won't see them used any other way. They're also used geographically if you're talking about a city inside of a country or inside of a state. If you're talking about dates or times, then you may also use commas. Commas are used in people's names sometimes if you're putting a junior or a senior. So these aren't the only times you're going to see commas, but in writing, these are the primary functions in which you are going to see commas used.
There are 2 primary uses for the semicolon in the English language. The first is to separate 2 closely related independent clauses within a sentence. If you use a semicolon, there's no need to include a coordinating conjunction such as and. The second use for a semicolon is to separate items in a list when the items are long and complicated or contain internal punctuation such as a comma. Ordinarily, you would use a comma to separate items in a list. But if the items contain commas within them, it may be confusing to separate the items with a comma. So that's where the semicolon comes in. Here we have one example sentence for each usage. In this first one, we have 2 independent clauses separated by a semicolon. So each of these clauses could stand on its own as a sentence, but we've chosen to combine them into a single sentence, and we do so with a semicolon. It's proper to use a semicolon in this sentence because the 2 phrases, I went to the doctor and he told me I had the flu, are very closely related to one another. Hearing that you have the flu is a direct result of going to the doctor. You would not, for instance, be able to use a semicolon in a situation where your 2 clauses were, I went to the doctor, I scored a 99 on my exam, because they're not related in the same way that these are. So in order to use a semicolon to separate 2 independent clauses, the 2 clauses must be very closely related to one another. The second example was items in a list. So as you can see here, we've got 3 items, and they are city-state combinations. So you'll recall the proper way to list out cities and states is city, comma, state. So each item has an internal comma. So it could be confusing to try to separate them with commas. So the proper usage in this instance is to use a semicolon to separate each of them. So these are the 2 primary uses for semicolons in English.
Dashes have 2 main functions. 1, they can be used in place of commas in order to set off a certain part of the sentence. Or 2, they can be used to show a pause in a quotation. So let's take a look at the first use. 2 states on the West Coast, Washington and Oregon, have amazing weather. So right here, Washington and Oregon could be omitted from the sentence. So try reading the sentence without Washington and Oregon in the sentence. 2 states on the West Coast have amazing weather. that sentence still makes perfect sense. So Washington and Oregon is just extra information. So what's one way you can set off additional information? Through the use of commas. So we could just put a comma right here after coast and a comma right here after Oregon. But in this case, the writer chose to use 2 dashes. So here the sentence reads, 2 states on the west coast, Washington and Oregon, have amazing weather. So here you pause and where the dashes are. Just like you would pause when you see a comma, pause where the dashes are. So it's 2 states on the west coast, Washington and Oregon, have amazing weather. So that's one way to use dashes, just to set a certain part off of the sentence from the rest of the sentence. Now also dashes can be used to show a pause in a quotation. Like right here, go to the left, turn right. So right here the speaker is telling the driver to go to the left, and then they pause for a second and realize that they actually need to go to the right, so they're saying turn right. So the dash right here is showing that the speaker thought for a minute, because otherwise the sentence wouldn't make sense without the dash, because the sentence would just read, go to the left, turn right. So the dash is needed here to show the reader that the speaker paused, thought about it, and then changed their mind. A dash can also be used at the end of the sentence if a speaker suddenly stops what they are saying. So it could be like, I was headed this way, then there's a dash, and then it could be Jim froze in fear when he saw the bear. So dashes can also be used at the end of a quotation. So just remember the 2 main ways that dashes can be used. Dashes aren't used very often, so use them sparingly and only when needed. It's important to choose the correct pronoun when you're writing or when you're speaking. So we're going to take a look at a tip or a little trick to be able to determine which pronoun to use. So you're going to want to restate sentences twice using each subject individually. So when you want to use a pronoun, you can usually whittle it down to 2 pronouns that you're looking at that you're trying to decide between. So what you want to do is try the sentence twice, each time with a different pronoun, and determine which one sounds correctly. Ideally, you're going to want to be familiar with the correct grammar rules to be able to figure out which pronoun to use. But obviously, in this case, if you're trying to decide between them, you don't know the grammar rules. So you're going strictly off of sound. That's because you've heard other people use pronouns correctly. So you just plug in each of the pronouns, and you'll be able to determine which one sounds correct. So right here, we have Bob and blank will be going. So we need to figure out the correct pronoun. So it's either going to be me or I. So now we just need to try both. Like Bob and me will be going. Well, that doesn't sound very good, so let's try I. Bob and I will be going. So we know that's correct. Now here we need a pronoun as well. So it's either going to be we or us. So we can try this out. We boys played football last year, or us boys played football last year. Well, immediately we notice that boys doesn't sound correct here. In fact, we need to eliminate boys, because you never want to use a pronoun and its antecedent next to each other. Like, say, for example, we were talking about somebody named Tim. Tim would be the antecedent for the pronoun he. So say Tim went to the store. We could instead say he went to the store. So the pronoun he would be standing for Tim, which would be the antecedent. So here, boys is the antecedent for we or us. So we don't need to use a pronoun and its antecedent, so we just eliminate boys here. So now we just try both of these. So we could say, we played football last year. Well, that sounds correct, but let's go ahead and try us as well. Us played football last year. Well, that doesn't sound right, so the correct answer is going to be we. So that doesn't take very long, and you don't actually have to write it out. Sometimes if you're just about to speak it, you can figure it out in your head. You can go through this test in your head and determine which pronoun is correct. Transitions are very helpful to the reader because they help the reader transition from one thought to another or one concept to another. Transitions can be placed at the beginning of a sentence or in the middle of a sentence, either to help the reader transition from one sentence to another or from one part of the sentence to another part of the sentence. So I want to take a look at many different kinds of transition words and phrases that can be used and how they can be used accurately in sentences. So first of all, transitions can be broken up into different kinds of transitions. So some transitions show addition, like the transitions next and in addition. Remember I said that we can also have transition phrases, and so this is a prepositional phrase acting as a transition. Another type of transition is a summary, like in conclusion or finally. And there are some transitions that show sequence, like later or then. And then finally, some transitions show contrast, like although or meanwhile. So how can you effectively use these transitions in sentences? Many times the transition word or transition phrase needs to go at the beginning of the sentence. Like here, this sentence says, next, bake the cookies for 10 minutes. So we put the transition at the beginning of the sentence and put a comma after it. Now, generally, commas come in pairs in sentences when they are showing that a certain part of the sentence isn't needed. So notice here that next could be removed from the sentence, and we could just read the sentence like this, bake the cookies for 10 minutes, and it would still make sense. So usually when you have some kind of phrase or word that could be omitted from the sentence, you put commas on both sides of it. Like here's part of a sentence, then there's a comma, here's the part of the sentence that isn't needed, another comma, then the rest of the sentence. But when a word or phrase comes at the beginning or the end of a sentence, you only need one comma because you wouldn't put a comma before next. That would look funny. So you just put a comma after it to show that next isn't there. So although next isn't essential to the sentence, it's helpful because it helps the reader understand the transition from one thought to another. In this case, the next step in directions on how to bake cookies. All right, this next sentence says, although I enjoy the outdoors, I do not like to run. Although is a transition that shows contrast. And notice here there's not a comma right after although. It's placed after outdoors. But again, although I enjoy the outdoors could be removed from the sentence, and it would still make sense. It would just say, I do not like to run. Nevertheless, this part of the sentence is still important to the overall paper. Now, notice that in certain cases, you have to continue the sentence for it to make sense. Like here, it wouldn't matter whether next was here or not. But since you've put although right here, you have to finish the sentence. You couldn't say, although I enjoy the outdoors. Because I enjoy the outdoors makes sense by itself, but once you add although to it, you're telling the reader that there's something else that needs to come. So after you put, although I enjoy the outdoors, you have to put, I do not like to run to finish out the sentence. So the things that are important to remember from this session is that there are many different kinds of transitions that can be classified into different categories. And there's many more categories we could have listed and many more transitions we could have listed under each category. And then generally, the transition word or phrase is going to go at the beginning of the sentence. And in this case, where there's a phrase at the beginning of the sentence that is started off by a transition word, make sure you finish the sentence and don't leave the reader hanging by writing a fragment. Sometimes choosing the correct pronoun can be difficult. Consider this sentence. Ron and blank left. So here, you either need to insert the pronoun Ron and I left or Ron and me left. So how do you choose the correct one? Well, I'll go ahead and tell you that the correct response is I. The sentence should read, Ron and I left. Now, there is a grammatical way to come to that conclusion, but there's an easy trick to figure it out. Try removing the first noun in the sentence. So if we remove Ron and then we just read the sentence like this, it's much more easy to figure out which pronoun to use. We can read the sentence two ways. We can try I left, or we can say me left. Me left obviously is not grammatically correct. So the correct pronoun here must be I left. So then that means we can plug I into the sentence, and the sentence makes sense, like Ron and I left. All right, let's look at another option, or another example. He gave Ron and blank a gift. He gave Ron and blank a gift. So here, do we insert the pronoun I or me? Well, let's try the trick again and remove Ron and from the sentence. So we can try it two ways. Once by inserting the pronoun I and once by inserting the pronoun me. He gave me a gift. Or we could read it as he gave I a gift. Here, I does not sound grammatically correct. So me must be the correct response because he gave me a gift sounds grammatically correct. So me is the correct pronoun to insert in the blank. So the sentence now reads, he gave Ron and me a gift. And that is the correct way to do it. So again, the more you get familiar with these pronouns, the easier it will be to determine which pronoun to use. But you can always use the trick of eliminating one of the nouns in the sentence to figure out which pronoun you need. Notice one more thing, that I always put the pronouns second, because in this case, these sentences were referring to the speaker. So say these sentences are referring to myself. Out of respect for the other person, you should always put yourself last in the order of people. So it wouldn't be correct to say, I and Ron left, or he gave me and Ron a gift. It always is grammatically correct to put yourself after the other people in the sentence.